that. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Josh and then let him take it away. And I have a very nice bio for him, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it. So Dr. Lohnes arrived at WVU in 2011 to study hydropolitics on Egypt's Sinai Peninsula under the direction of Dr. Karen Kolkassi. He defended a master's thesis titled Watering the St. Catherine's Landscape, Exploring the Nexus Between Socioeconomic and Hydrocultural Change in 2013. Following a year away from WVU to care for his newborn son, Josh embarked on a PhD under the supervision of Dr. Bradley Wilson, centered on action research with the Monongalia County Food and Hunger Committee, Conscious Harvest Co-op, Mountain People's Co-op, and First Hand Coffee. Funded by the USDA, Appalachian Food Shed Project, and the Benedum Foundation, his dissertation research explored the political economy of food banking networks in West Virginia through an institutional ethnography of expanding feeding lines. He defended a manuscript titled The Food Bank Fix, Hunger, Capitalism, and Humanitarian Reason in 2019. A postdoc funded by Mazon, is that right? Mm-hmm. Saw him transition to the role of director of the Food Justice Lab housed in the WVU Center for Resilient Communities, where he began engaging in the food policy process at local, state, and national levels, engaging with elected officials and food system and anti-hunger advocates in principles of food justice, food sovereignty, and the right to food. In 2022, Josh was hired as a research assistant professor in the Department of Geology and Geography, where he continues to engage in participatory action or participatory research at the intersection of local community food security work and global right to food advocacy. He's currently funded with the Mountaineer Food Bank. He's currently funded through there's a lot of funders here, through the One Foundation, WVU Extension Family Nutrition Program, a sub-grant with the Mountaineer Food Bank, and the From Now On Fund. Josh serves in leadership roles in the West Virginia Food for All Coalition, the West Virginia Agrarian Commons, the National Right to Food Community of Practice, and the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health, and Social Justice. He lives in the Norwood neighborhood of Morgantown, where he puts down a deep taproot with his wife Jenna and children Evie Lou, Elias, and Jude, and his dog Neo enjoys West Virginia too. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's really fun for me to be here for lots of different reasons, but mostly because I've sat through probably about 100 different colloquia in this room. And this presentation I'm about to give is really informed by a lot of those speakers that came and shared, and now I'm standing here doing the same. But as I was preparing this talk, I was also like, well, maybe this is my job talk that never actually happened, because I got hired in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I had a really anticlimactic job interview, 20 minutes on Zoom with 4 people, and never quite felt like I was able to present my own vision for what I'm doing in this department and really why I'm still here. So this, I was calculating, is my 7th talk here, both defending master's projects, PhD projects, practicing talks for the AAG. And this is the most relaxed I've been for any of them, so it's great. And then I was like, well, this is also my what am I still doing here talk. This is my what do I actually want to say now talk. And it's my nobody's telling me how to say it talk, which is cool. But then, you know, we're also in the midst of these institutional changes. We don't have any money for colloquium. We're doing an internal colloquium. We're mashing together geology and geography into the new sustainable colloquium series. So maybe this should be a professional development talk about what it means to be doing sustainability, action research methods. Maybe I reflect on the last 12 years, transitioning from a master's student to a research assistant professor, and the transformations that I've seen happen. Maybe it's actually these transformations is what I've been studying this whole time, right? Crisis, vulnerability, power, our own powerlessness to reshape institutions in the way we want to shape them. It's the first sustainability studies talk. What does that mean? Especially what does it mean in this place, in Brooks 325, at WVU, in West Virginia? What does it mean to be doing sustainability? I don't think many of us have figured that out yet. But then I was like, nope, sticking with what I know. I'm going to be talking about food, hunger, global capitalism, and resistance to the corporate capture of our food system. Earlier this week, I had the honor of presenting a brief to the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. It's a panel of 9 different lawyers and jurists around the world that sit on the human rights panel and review countries on how well they are fulfilling their treaty obligations. And I've been a part of this national right to food community of practice for a few years, and participated in a process of developing an 80-page brief to the Human Rights Commission about right to food violations in the United States. And I was honored to be asked to present a 1 minute and 45-second testimony to this panel on Tuesday morning in my study at home, my dog sleeping in the background. So I'm just going to read that. I'm going to read what I told this committee. I'm going to try to do it on my phone because I don't have it printed. I speak on behalf of people with lived experience of hunger and food insecurity, small farmers, and a broad coalition of food justice advocates across the United States, represented today by the University of Miami Human Rights Clinic, Why Hunger, West Virginia University Center for Resilient Communities, and the National Right to Food Community of Practice. I call attention to the failure to uphold the right to life, specifically related to the discriminatory food deprivation that poor people face in each of the 50 United States and its territories. Black, brown, and indigenous communities, female-headed households, children, farm and other food system workers, people experiencing homelessness, and incarcerated people are consistently the most affected by these violations. These begin in early childhood and can have lifelong impacts. Infants whose mothers are incarcerated are deprived of breast milk and suffer high mortality rates. Malnutrition can lead to behavioral and health issues that feed the school-to-prison pipeline. Inadequate government assistance programs fail to address root causes of household food insecurity and reinforce a cycle of dependence and charity instead of facilitating pathways toward food autonomy. Furthermore, the food system in the US relies on the cheap labor of immigrant farm workers and incarcerated people who perform hard labor in dangerous conditions and suffer disproportionately from hunger. This exploitative system benefits corporate monopolies that dominate the US food system and profit from its inequities. The US has repeatedly implemented legislation that discriminates against Black and brown people, hindering these communities' ability to own land and participate in food production and distribution markets, imbalances that hinder opportunities to build generational wealth. To fulfill its obligations as a state party to the ICCPR, the US should adopt a human rights-based national plan to end hunger that incorporates strong civic participation from those communities most affected, addressing legacies of enslaved, devalued, and incarcerated food system labor. By working to end systemic and discriminatory right to food violations and reform the industrial food system, the US has an opportunity to protect the health, well-being, and lives of the nation's most vulnerable communities through labor protections, fair wages, and robust entitlements to nutritious food that go beyond short-term, inadequate emergency relief. Thank you. So mind you, I had practiced this the night before. It was written with my colleagues. I made some edits, but I wasn't really ready for what this contribution actually was. I came an hour in after about these rapid fire testimonies from people expressing their violation of their human rights all across the country. Indigenous chiefs from Alaska, from Mississippi, from Florida, LGBTQ plus community, women, voters that couldn't access polls. And it just got heavier and heavier and heavier as each testimony went through. And my time came up and I read it, and it was so short and quick, and it was like, did I even do that well? But it was important, you know, and I had a grant to continue to write after that I did not feel like I wanted to put effort into. My sister in Austria was going through a hysterectomy, so my mind was elsewhere, right? And that's the reality of doing work. We have people, networks, ideas, and personal relationships that occupy our time. But this was an honor and important work, and I want to explain a little bit how and why a guy that came to West Virginia to study water in the Sinai Desert ended up giving testimony from this place about human right to food violations. Bradley, Dr. Wilson, and I were finally able to birth this paper, which we began before the COVID-19 pandemic, went through different iterations, editorials, and it's finally been released, reflecting on 10 years of action research, accompanying different community food security, anti-hunger stakeholders across the state of West Virginia. So this is long-term work, right? It didn't just happen in a vacuum that all of a sudden I was showing up and speaking to the UN. It has roots in a lot of research, a lot of relationships, and also a lot of organizing, right? Organizing with people to change the conditions that they are living under. This is a piece of art by Boy Dominguez. He regularly contributes covers to the Journal of Peasant Studies. And some of you in this room have already wrestled with this photo. Others may be seeing it for the first time. But I'd like to open with this and just get some feedback about what you're seeing to make our lecture a little more participatory. Anyone want to take a first crack? What do you see on this image?
A big snake.
A big snake, yeah. Good. And what is that snake? What is it representing?
It's supposed to represent the capitalist system.
Yeah, the capitalist food system, right? With a big head eating its tail. But its tail is also made up of what? People. People. It's like made up of people that are struggling to survive. That includes, by the way, us up here in the cities. Right? There's a geography to this image. You don't really necessarily see this everyday conflict between the head and the tail of this snake. What else do you see?
And there's kind of a hierarchy to it as well, because the workers are out at the bottom, while people at top that have all the wealth and all of the cities don't really notice at the bottom. Good, yeah. There are certain people doing the labor in our food system, while others are benefiting in consuming that labor, consuming that environment, literally, right? Food is one of the things that ties us most intimately to our environment. So when we're thinking about sustainability in food, these are important questions. As we go up, we also see different production practices, right? Here we see diversified,
crop and ecosystems, and as we go up, kind of into monocrops and pesticides and kind of well-ordered supply chains, pushing food through to this vast processing centers that are actually overflowing, right? We have way too much food. We have a food waste problem. What else do you see?
Some folks trying to fight the snake.
Yeah, there's folks fighting the snake right now. And those folks aren't, by the way, just in the global south, as this picture may make us seem to believe. There are people in the cities fighting the snake, people all across the world fighting this snake and really fighting for their right to survive and to be autonomous in the way that they choose to survive, to build their food systems. It's one other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet. It's actually the theme of the cover of this journal.
Centrality of oil.
Yeah. So we see a bunch of cars. There is a time-space compression happening. Right? Things are accelerating. But also, this special issue is about biofuels, right? In the way that biofuels, if you go to the pump today, you see 15% ethanol. That's corn, right? And that's taxing land in different ways, kicking people off land in different ways. So there's a social contest over our food system, basically, an ongoing social contest. And when we pull up to Dunkin' Donuts and order coffee and donuts, we don't necessarily think of that social contest all the time. I'm unfortunately do a lot too often, for my mental health. But there is this contest. It's happening. And what we see in places like West Virginia in the food system is not so much necessarily the contest itself, but this idea of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore terms organized abandonment. Right? So capitalism tends to produce certain kinds of landscapes at certain times and then pull back from those at others when it's no longer profitable. In West Virginia, we're seeing this all over the state, right? We're the only state in the country that had a declining population in the last census. So therefore, food, in the midst of this organized abandonment, where it's no longer profitable to make money here off of food, becomes a real crisis for people. And we're seeing all of these different initiatives around improving access to food and local healthy food access projects and different kinds of organizing around food. When we think about organized abandonment, we might actually think about a refugee camp somewhere, right? This might not concern us, but what I spent 5 years thinking about was these kinds of feeding lines that are in our midst every single day. In one of the 55 West Virginia counties each week, big truck pulls up from Mountaineer Facing Hunger Food Bank. People line up and they ask for food. And this food is sometimes of good quality, sometimes it's really not. When I was participating in this distribution, we were distributing frozen chicken, which was just from the US government, excess cranberries from the US government, corn from Walmart, multivitamins from CVS, light bulbs. It was just a big dump of product for poor people to consume. And is this really the best we can do? That's kind of the question, right? Is this the best way that we can nourish our communities? In 2013, when I finished my master's project, and I was with a few friends from the GGG, actually, wanted to do something. We just wanted to like act in the midst of this organized abandonment. And so co-founded this group called the Conscious Harvest Cooperative, whose mission was really to develop alternative food sourcing strategies for food pantries in Monongalia County, while offering access to people that may not have land to grow their own food. And we started this with zero money, just a bunch of donations, a bunch of volunteers coming out, tilling the soil. And it's really a project that occupied me for the next 4 or 5 years. We did seed exchanges. We, bought a huge water tank to bring water down there. And this, project is still going. It's at the corner of Greenbag Road and where the old Atomic Grill was, and Kingwood Pike there. There's now all these like save our farm, the roundabout's coming kind of activism, right? So that's actually the tail and the head of the beast kind of activism. Like, I don't want to lose my land. The state is taking my land and I'm pissed about it, right? So there's going to be a big roundabout there at some point. But the cool thing is that in the midst of that protest, the Monongalia County Planning Commission and Morgantown City Council worked out a deal with the Department of Highways. The Department of Highways is going to compensate the garden by just throwing $20,000 to the city to invest, right? Small win, but something's happening. There's action. There's new money. And $20,000 is way more than we ever had to start that farm. In the midst of institutionalizing this idea, right, we made lots of connections, ideas. Let's not just give food away to poor people. Let's engage low-income folks in the regional food economy. Can we do subsidized CSA shares with Mountain Harvest Farm, where a food pantry user just pays $50 a year instead of $400 a year to access the exact same food? Yes, we can do that. And so we experimented with it in the Shack Neighborhood House, and more people just started being like, oh, I want to get involved, and I'm writing my dissertation, just like, oh, why did I do this? This is not like what I actually wanted to do. But in reflecting on it, I think it was a really good way for me to root myself in this community, get to know a lot of people, and also think through my food politics. Right, and here we have Jeffrey and Justin and myself, and they wouldn't mind me poking fun at them and myself. Jeffrey, I just need access to land. Like, I live in one of these new developments where there's no land and I want to garden. And the fact that we give away food is cool too. That was really his motivation for participating. And after a few years, I'm just like, but what's the point of all this anyway, if all of our food is still locked behind a paywall? We can only common so much for one another before we're still dabbling in this commodified capitalist food system. And Justin, who was a PhD student in history, is like, because of wampum, man, wampum, the exchange relations that indigenous communities had before white men arrived, there is a way to build our social relations differently. And because of the diggers, those folks that got kicked off the land in the UK in the early Industrial Revolution and just went and took it back. That's why we're doing this. And so, good debates, but also in the midst of reading, preparing my comps, encountering the whiteness of these spaces, the injustices of people trying to reform the food system in a very particular way that gets wrapped up in identity politics, etc. So really the limits of trying to reform our food system simply by acting idealistically. But this idea also came out of a previous experience that I had had in Worcester, Massachusetts before I moved here, working with a refugee resettlement organization called Lutheran Social Services of New England, and was able to interact with new Americans from Iraq and Bhutan and Burma and Congo. And I was supposed to find them jobs. That was my job. There's a new Iraqi that arrived last week. He needs to find a job in 2 months or he loses his benefits. Okay? And this was 2009. What happened in 2008? Whole system just like, we thought it was over maybe. It wasn't. But when I went with Mohammed to the Netflix sorting center and said, can you give this person a job? They would say, well, no, we just fired like 50 people. If we hire anyone back, it'll be our own people. So some members of this community said, I want to grow my own food. So I found a community garden in Worcester, showed them the plots. They're like, no, I need big land. So then we found a 4-acre farm and got them plots. And it was a really cool experimentation in community building around food with a network of people that were coming from all over the world and had different ideas of what community food security meant. But for me, it was also an entry point into the US Social Security system. And by that, I mean housing, food, healthcare, and how the poor navigate survival in this place. And so that learning never quite left, right after the Sinai question that I was posing, which in retrospect was also a lot about food, about provisioning, about changing provisioning practices. And it's a really special place to me. I spent quite a bit of time there, and I was fascinated by these gardens and the water, the wells that fed them, and the opportunity for self-sufficiency that the Bedouin developed in this very, very harsh environment. There's my daughter during field work. It's crazy, she's now in 7th grade. But these are apricots that, there's just a lot of them. They used to dry them. They're called mishmish, and dry them and sell them in cities, Cairo, Amman, right? But in the 1990s, the price of these things just collapsed with global commodity chains. You couldn't really make any money off dried apricots. So the new form of income was tourism, right? And folks were migrating into this new city that the Egyptian government was pouring resources into because they wanted to urbanize and occupy the peninsula and claim it as their own, as a geopolitical project. So food got wrapped up into all of those dynamics, and folks were all of a sudden needing to exchange cash from elsewhere in a global capitalist tourist economy into food, right? And I learned a lot about dependencies there. But I was also, partaking in the food system in the Sinai and in the heavily subsidized bread that the Egyptian government provides for its people. This new book by Jessica Barnes came out. I went to the Author Meets Critics at the AAGs last year, and it really kind of helped me to consolidate the last 10 years of research into some coherence around what I do and why I do it. And it's really thinking through the critical role of the state in food provisioning. And I don't know how many of you know about the Egyptian state. It's quite authoritarian, quite brutal. And yet her institutional ethnography of this state is kind of the contest around how they go out of their way to make sure that people have bread. The history of struggle over the demands for bread, that it be available, accessible, affordable. But really, she delves into the intimate ethnographies of everyday life of mostly women and their political practice of securing bread every day, right? And that's a negotiation between cooking at home or going for the heavily subsidized bread. It's about time, it's about family, it's about labor. And so I want to transition us out of these reflections toward now this image by the same artist, also cover of the Journal of Peasant Studies. And what do you see here? I still have tons of slides, so I'm just going to tell you what I want you to see. The world is in crisis. We all know that. We're in a new school of sustainability that's supposedly going to address these crises. Right? Everything from rapid and rampant urbanization, deforestation, climate and migrant crises, desertification, dams, pollution, social contest, right? All of these things are happening in front page of our social anxieties right now. What kind of world are my kids going to inherit? What kind of world are my grandkids are they going to be able to live on this planet? Right? But what I really, really like about this image is that food is shown in its regenerative potential to address many of these intersecting issues in our world. It's not addressing them currently, but there's a lot of people doing good work to try and focus our attention on the need to repoliticize food in our everyday lives and existences. Two speakers came here in 2019. One of them was Stephen Healy from Australia, and he spoke here about his work with communities in Australia, trying to figure out what do people actually want in order to face 50-degree days in the Australian summer, right? How do we organize workshops and conversations locally to figure out how we're going to adapt to climate change? After his visit and conversations with us, he just like pumped out this paper, like planetary food commons and post-capitalist, post-COVID food futures. Bunch of co-authors and like, wow, that's cool. And that's actually a really, really wonderful idea. Why don't we try to work toward a planetary food commons? Why are we locking everything up behind a paywall all the time? And then Ashley Woodard Henderson was here in a packed room offering up her politics, the politics of utopia, right? And asking, well, what is your utopia? Do you even have one? And if you don't, then why are you here in so many words, right? Even though that utopia may never come to pass, it's very hopeful to be doing work with some kind of broader vision in mind. And I think a global planetary food commons is one of my utopias that I hold up there in my everyday work. So food as commons, this is kind of the academic-y breakdown of what that means. This guy, José Luis Vivero Paul, wrote his dissertation on food as commons, wrote this special issue, a bunch of people, including the former special rapporteur on the right to food. And he basically helps us think about the different dimensions of food in our lives. Most of the way that we encounter food is as commodity. Again, you go to Dunkin' Donuts, you go to Kroger, you go to Aldi, you go to the Mountain Lair, WVU Dining Services that's now been privatized into Sodexo, right? There's this force of the commodification of food that is rampant and at work. Food is a tradable good. It's always been a tradable good. It's not necessarily new that we're trading food. It's new the way that we are trading it in the commodity form. But food is also a renewable resource. Food is sacred for many of us, right? We have rites and rituals and cosmologies that include food. Food's obviously essential for us to live. It's a public good. It's a human right. And it determines so much of our cultural makeup. And yet, we don't tend to talk and make policy around these other dimensions, right? We tend to make policy to reinforce the concept of food as commodity. a lot of what I did in my dissertation is try to understand moral economies of food provisioning. Why is it that people care so deeply about feeding the poor and will volunteer hours and hours of labor time to collect food waste from Walmart and redistribute that to their neighbors? There's a moral economy there of feeding that's important to recognize and to understand. But there's a rich literature on moral economies and geography around the way that moral economies that were meant to protect communities against hunger. So social codes, you do this for me now, I'll do this for you then. Norms and regulation around production. Let's make sure that we don't overfish this lake, otherwise there'll be no fish left, right? These things end up getting disrupted when capitalist food systems enter the mix. And so a bunch of scholars in the 70s and 80s started really studying what are the social responses to food access failure in these contexts. Whole other group of scholarship is concerned with, well, how do we historically govern this problem of hunger? Okay, this has been a problem that under capitalism has grown, but has also created more and more responsibility for the state as the container of capital to attend to. So Vernon writes a book about the history of the management of hunger under the British Empire. And it's a wonderful book that ends in 1950. Mike Davis writes about the way that hunger was produced in India, governed, managed, and understood both in the metropole of the empire and beyond the empire. What's important is that we can trace a specific history here of the production and management of hunger since the late 18th century in relationship to uneven class, racial, and gendered relations. And a whole other side of this literature is really about states, entitlements, geopolitics, how hunger is used and leveraged in international fora to further the goals and desires of empire. So these are all theories that are like bouncing around in my head all the time as I do my work. And I'm going to bring us back to West Virginia. But I'm going to do that by forcing us to look at some early 20th century propaganda from the United States. This is World War I posters that were made, 1916, 17, 18, as the US was growing in its hegemony over the world system, right? And agriculture and food was a huge part of that hegemony. And so these posters, which are beautiful, beautifully done, can also tell us a lot about kind of the mentality that we bring to food production and hunger relief in the United States. Sow the seeds of victory. Plant and raise your own vegetables. Every garden is a munition plant. Food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. We'll waste nothing. Food's needed for the Allies. Hunger breeds madness. America's food must save the world. Okay, and we were growing very powerful in the way that we leveraged food to feed the world. We were also representing ourselves as the benevolent country helping others to no longer be hungry. Will you help save the women of France? They're struggling against starvation and trying to feed not only themselves and their children, but their husbands and sons who are fighting in the trenches. Save wheat. Herbert Hoover, the businessman turned diplomat turned US president, was selected to manage the US Food Service Administration during the war. This is what he said over the course of one of his speeches. Of course, the prime objective of the United States is undertaking the fight against famine in Europe is to save the lives of starving people. The secondary objective, however, and hardly of less importance, is to defeat anarchy, which is the handmaiden of hunger. But interestingly, very, very, very quickly, about a decade later, hunger came home to roost in the heart of the United States, right? Financial crash of 1929, farmer prices tank, people can't get jobs in cities, they're lining up for food, and there's this weird, too much food, not enough people to buy that food, and the state steps in. The first farm bill gets written. The US Department of Agriculture becomes this behemoth that it is today. And there's a politics to this. In 1930s, we had hunger marches, we had hunger strikes, we had people demanding their right to life and their right to food. In Roosevelt, you know, the feeding line is actually now anchored in our national myth. This is on the US Mall in Washington, D.C. at the Roosevelt Memorial. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's my favorite memorial on the mall. And Roosevelt was actually really concerned with inequity in society. His wife was the crafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, in 1948, corralled the 58 different member nations of the UN at that time to vote and adopt this code. Article 2227 sanctions an individual's economic, social, and cultural rights, which includes the right to food. And in 1976, with a much larger body of the UN, that actually came into full effect. So we are, many of us geographers in this room. Who can tell me what this is a map of without a legend?
Is it I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Alex.
Can't all hear Kate. The countries that support food as a human right.
Yeah, in many ways, this map I called from Wikipedia. Okay. And this is their legend. The purple is the countries that have actually adopted a human right framework in their law or constitution. Purple and blue. All right. Yellow via international treaties, red via the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That means that these countries are reviewed periodically on how well they are fulfilling the right to food by panels like the one that I testified to on Tuesday. In gray, these are the countries that have no known right to food. The Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights was proposed by President Carter to the Congress in the 1970s. It was taken up for debate and never ratified. Okay, Carter is 99, he's in hospice, and he's about to die. That's how long ago we had this debate in this country. But what is the right to food anyway? You know, I mean, this utopia that you talk about. I get this a lot, you know, and I'm wrestling with, well, what does the right to food mean in this country? Perhaps where we aren't really where the head and the tail of the monster meet. But the UN Charter defines it as the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food of means of its procurement. It's an indivisibly linked to the inherent dignity of the human person. Okay, and it's the normative human right framework as it currently stands is food should be accessible, food should be adequate, food should be available, and food should be sustainable, meaning it's there for us tomorrow and future generations. Now, right to food scholars are also trying to really inject this idea of agency as a principle, as a fifth principle in the right to food. Meaning, do we have the capacity to determine our own food systems? Do I have the capacity with my vote, not just the vote with my fork that I can afford, right? But my vote at the polls to determine the shape of my food system at the local, state, national, federal level. My favorite interpretation of the right to food is Ellen Messer, an anthropologist who's been studying this for a long time. And her take is the right to food is the secular version of what most of our cosmologies have had since time immemorial. There's always been some kind of code for humans to take care of one another and nourish one another. The right to food is the secular version of that. And of course, it taps on all of these different UN Sustainable Development Goals once that right would be realized. What about here in almost heaven, West Virginia? What does the right to food look like? Well, we know we have highly, highly uneven foodways. Okay. I already showed you a picture of Parsley Bottom, West Virginia, in Mingo County, where people line up for food. That also happens here in Mon County. In Mon County, we have 2 Walmarts, 3 Krogers, 2 Aldis. Where else do y'all shop? 2 Giant Eagles, a Target, and in Clay County, they don't have a grocery store. Okay, they have to drive to Charleston to get food. That's not right. That some of us would be able to realize our right to food so easily, and others would have to struggle so much. What about this Whole Foods image up here? Do we have a Whole Foods in West Virginia? How come? We need to invite Bezos over here. Right? We're too poor to have a Whole Foods, guys. All right, so when we organize our food system around the commodity form and the profit motive, it creates uneven development in differentiated foodways. Food deserts or food apartheid, it's not natural. Okay, it's a result of the economic and political actions in place. So over the past 7 or so years, we've been engaging with communities through this Nourishing Networks curriculum, which tries to help foster conversations about healthy food access across the state of West Virginia. The goal is to raise up human resources for food system change. I won't go over the entire methodology. Check out the FoodLink website if you're interested. But out of the findings from these workshops, the top 10 issues, the top 10 food access barriers that have come out are lack of transportation, low income, decline of absence of jobs, lack of food retailers, lack of communication for resources, social stigmas and discrimination, government regulations, drug addiction, education and knowledge, community health. Is there anywhere there that says lack of food? And yet, this is how we're resolving this problem and continue to resolve this problem. And I think we need to be asking ourselves why. When people are just asking to be able to get to the grocery store, to afford to get to the grocery store, to exchange their SNAP benefits for food, this is our answer. But I'm not a pessimist. And I think Jahi is actually on the call, which is really cool, because his book has informed a lot of my activism over the past few years. And he looks at the right to food movement in Brazil, specifically the town of Belo Horizonte, which I say town, but there's more people that live there than the entire state of West Virginia. Looking at the way that, this doesn't get realized overnight, and it's definitely institutions that need to be built to bring it about. And we should have active optimism that this is possible, because the numbers in Brazil are astounding. And what happened in Belo Horizonte was then picked up by the central government for the Zero Fome initiative, the Zero Hunger initiative, and has brought down levels of hunger significantly while supporting agroecological practices. And he says, like all aspects of the future, the institutions for food sovereignty and food security are not evenly distributed. They're not even always easily apparent, but they are there. And I continue to believe that in my work here in the Department of Geography and Geology, which has hired me to do this work. Quick little tidbit about scale. All right. If any of you are interested in scale, I recommend this book by Andrew Herod, which kind of consolidates theories of what is scale in geography. How do we understand the local in relation to the global? What are the containers that we create for ourselves, either political containers as a state or social containers as an organization? How do those understand their positions, their scalar positions? But ultimately, scale is everything and it's nothing. Okay? But it's important still to reflect on and to think about, especially when building social movements. Because this is kind of the work I've been involved in, right? It's impossible to go straight to the global scale and be active without having projects, ideas informed from below. It's also impossible to advance any kind of policy, whether it's food or water or climate or gun control or abortion, without a coalition of people that are willing to come together under a united voice to advocate for things. And that's difficult, right? It's difficult at the state level in West Virginia, which these are our advocates for the right to food in the state of West Virginia. These are the people we are advocating to change the rules. Department of Health and Human Resources, Department of Education, Office of Child Nutrition, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Senior Services, all of them have a hand to play in food access in our state. Go up another scale, the USDA Food and Nutrition Service has a $750 billion budget to distribute food aid in SNAP, in school meals, in WIC, in emergency food. All right, how is that governed? How is it organized? Who wins from all of that money circulating? U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, National Family Farm Coalition. I just put a bunch of logos up here. There are a lot more, but these are the ones that I'm engaged in. And then the global level is so important because what we're starting to see from our global allies, like, whoa, there's actually a right to food movement emerging in the US. This is great, you know, because in every international forum, the US is the first to say, nope, no right to food for us. Okay, and they justify that. They justify that in very eloquent ways, but they are still hindering the food sovereignty of people all across the world. So there's these international networks that are now forming around the right to food with the National Right to Food Community Practice. So a lot of my work's been here in West Virginia, building coalitions, trying to repoliticize food, trying to say like, hey, I know it's maybe like 10th or 11th when you go vote, but maybe think about food next time. Maybe like you do eat it every day. It does affect the world that you live in. Just like those Egyptians that have food as an everyday political practice, maybe we could learn a little bit from that. Working to think about how we establish an Office of Community Food Security. This is, again, based on learning from practice in other places, like Belo Horizonte, and that's moving. I mean, I'm having conversations at the legislature, and it's not hyper-politicized like a lot of issues are in our society today. People are hungry. Yeah, there's different ways we're going to get there to figure it out. Like we don't want to have to spend money in a fiscal note and this and that, but there is political opportunity in food to actually bring a diverse group of political ideologies together. Delegate Danielle Walker, she was our delegate until last March. She introduced a constitutional amendment for the right to food in the state of West Virginia. That one was modeled on the one that passed in Maine. Okay, this is just introducing this has placed West Virginia on the right to food map in the US and spurred and opened a debate. Is it ever going to happen? Are the 130 people at the legislature actually going to let we the people go and vote that we want this as an amendment? Maybe. We can try. We can call them enough. But it would be really cool if this were written in our Constitution. All people have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to food, including the right to acquire, produce, process, prepare, preserve, and consume the food of their own choosing by hunting, gathering, foraging, farming, fishing, gardening, and saving, and exchanging seeds, or by barter, trade, or purchase from sources of their own choosing for their nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being, as long as an individual does not commit trespassing, theft, poaching, or other abuses of private property rights, public lands, or natural resources in the acquisition of food. Furthermore, all people have a fundamental right to be free from hunger, malnutrition, starvation, and the endangerment of life from the scarcity or lack of access to nourishing food. Who would vote on that resolution? Most of us in this state, I guarantee it. I didn't write this. Senator Craig Hickman from Maine is on the call. These are his words. Right? They've traveled to the West Virginia legislature. So this is a national movement, a global movement, and we need to be building it. We've just received some money from a generous funder to help seed this movement under the banner Voices of Hunger, West Virginia, trying to really get those with lived experience to take control of the policy process rather than the Mountaineer Food Banks and American Friends Service Committees and Food Justice Labs and West Virginia Center for Budget and Policy designing the policy. Like, no, Nick, Marjorie Gardens, what needs to be designed for you to eat well? Okay? This is really, really, really critical. But it's hard too. It's hard. People have been burned, made promises that this will happen and that'll happen and the government will come through, and it just doesn't. So how do we do this well without being exploitative, right? Being generous of spirit. I'm at time. One of the guys that joined the Voices of Hunger call is someone that was himself experiencing homelessness and hunger and had to steal from sheets when he was hungry. That guy is Brian Butcher. He's our city councilor. He introduced a city resolution for the right to food in Morgantown. The governor proclaimed food as a human right after one phone call last year. I was just like, hey, can you add this in the thing? Oh, yeah, sure. Food's a human right. Okay, then that circulates. It's like, oh, West Virginia governor is saying food's a human right. That's the opportunity of doing work here, is that it is a very small city hall of 1.8 million people. We're connecting and learning from broader movements. Global Network for the Right to Food, I already mentioned. This is a tribunal in the city of Miami, a public tribunal, putting the city on trial for criminalizing the public distribution of food to groups of over 25 people. All right? 60-year-old women in the street giving food to unhoused folks are being arrested. So we put the city on trial, and 2 of the judges were from West Virginia. And that's cool. Wrote a Miami declaration. That declaration is circulating, and we're using our own WVU ArcGIS tools to create a map of all the signatories. These are the institutional resources that we can bring to bear on movement building. I'm going to end with Tobler because Dr. Harris, who is on all of my committees, loves this guy, and everything, the first law of geography, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Okay, so we need to be where we are in order to actually affect the broader geographies that we're trying to change. Another guy that's really informed my thinking is Jacques Ellul, Christian anarchist, that basically termed the word glocal. I mean, there's like debate about who actually said this think globally, act locally, but this was his ethic. This was his posture. And I think this is not just a term, right? It's not just like, oh yeah, think global, act local. Like we do actually need to act in the place that we live in order to have impacts elsewhere. Here's my job talk stuff. I've published all these papers, I have all this money, and I'm here only if I keep doing them. I am the ultimate product of the neoliberal university. Okay? Very low job security unless I bring my own soft money in. And it can be precarious, it can feel frustrating at times, but there's also opportunity in this. And I think as all of our jobs change, as there's new pressures on what this department is, yeah, I'm just happy to be a part of it and to continue to do this work with you all, because this department has made this work possible. So my last few questions for us to go ruminate on at Mountain State with pizza and beer. This is home. All right, the dark clouds above Woodburn Hall. Home. This is my home with Neo waiting for me by the tree. And I've been wrestling with this place for a long time. This place as my home. How do we effectively balance work of the academy, professional and personal pressures, with the work of meaningfully engaging our communities? What's our posture in the context of the intentional dismantling and transformation of our home institution? What alternative institutional formations are we collectively building from within and from without that will reshape our everyday lives? It's often a hashtag struggle to stay in this place, but if the work and relationships I engage in within and beyond my home are not rooted in the place I'm planted, cui bono? Who does it benefit? And with that, we're going to go answer those questions at the Colloquium Social Hour from 4 to 6. Here's a Venmo code. That's my Venmo. If you guys want to send money so that we can buy pizza and beer, or if you just want to buy other people pizza and beer, I think we should really do this. I asked Brent, he never wrote me back, which I'm taking as a yes. So I'll see you there.
Especially faculty, if faculty want to contribute.
Yes,
right?
faculty for sure. And if we have extra, we'll see what happens, but let's like create our new institution.
So, Josh, do you want to take, I don't know how much.
It's late. I know I took an hour. I can take questions for sure if people are willing to stick around.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for that presentation. Maybe if folks want to stick around and ask Josh questions, because we are at time, feel free to do so. Stick around for a couple minutes, Josh.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much, and thank you to Josh, and hopefully see folks at the social hour, not mandatory, and then again on October 13th for our next colloquium panel.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks.
Don't tell Brent about this.
No.
I like being